You wake before dawn, listening to your own breath, as if it's a ticker, and the dark room feels priced in with quiet dread. Outside, the city glows faintly, but you sense the glow is borrowed, like light rented by the hour, with interest hidden in shadows. You check the news like a mirror, searching for your face, and find only numbers staring back, cold and patient, refusing to blink. You tell yourself you are in control, yet every promise you made now sounds like a coin dropped into a deep, unseen well. In your pocket, receipts crumple like old apologies, and you feel them pressing through fabric, reminding you what you can't afford to forget. People laugh in cafes, but you hear it as static, a cheerful mask over a humming wire that could spark with one careless touch. You walk past shop windows and see reflections layered on reflections, as if the world has too many versions of itself to trust. At your desk, you open statements like letters from estranged friends, and every line reads friendly until you notice the fine, quiet threat. You taste coffee and it tastes thinner than yesterday, like someone is watering down comfort, stretching it to cover a widening gap. Rumors move through your contacts like fever, and you smile back in messages while your chest tightens, convinced you're being watched. You hear the word inflation spoken softly, not as a fact, but as a curse that keeps returning no matter how many doors you lock. Prices climb like ivy on a ruined wall, and you realize your wages are a small candle, burning shorter each night without warning. Your savings sit in the bank like a sleeping child, and you fear waking it, because it might open its eyes and not recognize you. Every bill arrives dressed as routine, yet each envelope feels heavier, as if paper learned to carry the weight of your future. In quiet moments, you imagine gold not as metal, but as a lifeboat, and you hate how quickly your mind learns to beg. You watch charts rise like a tide against a doorstep, and you keep moving furniture, pretending the water isn't already inside. Friends talk about new records with bright voices, but you hear a siren, because records are what break right before silence. You start counting time in purchases you postpone, and each delay feels like surrender, one small retreat that teaches your fear new routes. At night, you dream of coins turning to dust in your hands, and you wake with palms open, ashamed of how empty they look. You realize the collapse isn't a crash, but a slow confession, and you are the one forced to say it, line by line, to yourself. Morning arrives without relief, and you dress slowly, feeling time tighten around you like a tailored suit stitched with quiet obligation. The streets feel narrower today, as if buildings leaned inward overnight, listening to your footsteps and counting them carefully. You pass a headline shouted from a screen, and it feels like someone calling your name in a crowded room. At work, smiles trade places with glances, and you sense everyone measuring distance, deciding who might fall first. Your inbox fills with polite urgency, words arranged neatly to hide the panic sweating beneath each sentence. Lunch tastes of habit, not hunger, and you chew slowly, aware that even comfort now asks permission. You remember a time when numbers felt solid, like bricks, not smoke that slipped through your fingers. In meetings, voices overlap like waves, and you struggle to tell guidance from echo. You nod, often, learning the language of agreement even as your stomach knots with unsaid doubt. Outside, clouds gather without rain, and the air hums, charged but unresolved, mirroring your thoughts. Someone mentions gold casually, like an old friend's name, and the room grows still for half a second too long. You feel envy rise, sharp and unwelcome, aimed at anyone who seems lighter, less anchored to worry. Your phone vibrates with alerts, each one a small tap on the shoulder you can't shrug off. You start to sense value shifting underfoot, like sand rearranging itself beneath a standing crowd. By afternoon, your head aches from holding composure, from keeping fear folded and unseen. You watch sunlight fade earlier than expected, and it feels like a decision made without consulting you. On the commute home, faces blur into a single expression of guarded patience. You grip a rail and imagine it bending, testing how much weight belief can carry. Evening brings quiet again, but it is not rest, only a pause that lets dread sharpen. You fall asleep, knowing tomorrow will ask the same questions, and you still won't have answers. The next morning feels heavier, as if gravity learned your name overnight and decided to lean closer, testing how steady you really are. You scroll past celebrations of growth, and each headline feels like a stranger boasting while standing on your chest. Your reflection in glass looks thinner somehow, stretched by worry, like an image pulled too far across a screen. Conversations drift towards certainty, but you hear only rehearsed confidence, brittle as glass tapped too often. You start noticing silence between words, long pauses where fear briefly shows its face before being hidden again. Someone jokes about prices rising forever, and the laughter lands wrong, echoing like humor told at a funeral. You feel your patience fray, thread by thread, each demand tugging until you fear the whole seam might split. In private, you count expenses like steps in the dark, careful, slow, afraid of where the floor might drop. You remember trusting systems the way you trusted weather, assuming tomorrow would behave like yesterday. Now every forecast feels personal, aimed directly at your plans, rewriting them without asking permission. Gold appears again in your thoughts, warm and distant, a color that refuses to fade when everything else does. You resent yourself for the comfort that thought brings, for how quickly desperation learns new prayers. The afternoon drags, and time stretches thin, like metal bent but not yet broken. You overhear whispers about safety, about shelter, and you wonder when survival replaced ambition so quietly. Your hands tremble slightly, betraying you in small, humiliating ways no one else seems to notice. Evening news plays softly, and every calm voice sounds practiced, like lullabies meant for adults who can't sleep. You feel trapped between holding on and letting go, unsure which choice would hurt less in the end. The city lights flicker, and for a moment you imagine them dimming all at once, leaving only questions behind. You sit alone, listening to your own thoughts grow louder, realizing silence has become your sharpest mirror. You understand now that loss doesn't announce itself. It settles in gently, teaching you to accept less each day. By the fourth morning, you feel older, not by years, but by weight, like days have learned to stack themselves on your spine. You shave and watch hair fall into the sink, thinking how easily small things detach when pressure becomes routine. The radio hums reassurance, yet every calm phrase feels rehearsed, practiced until sincerity wore thin and quiet. You leave home knowing doors lock behind you, but sensing the real openings are elsewhere, widening without permission. On the street, conversations float past, fragments about costs and corners cut, each one grazing you like grit. You catch yourself calculating mid-step, measuring distance in money, time in what it might still buy. Posters promise stability with bright smiles, and you feel insulted by how confidently they lie. At work, decisions arrive pre-made, and your role becomes nodding, carrying outcomes you never shaped. You notice how often people avoid the future tense, speaking only of today, as if tomorrow were impolite. Lunch breaks shorten, and hunger becomes a background noise you learn to ignore, like traffic beyond a closed window. Someone mentions records again, and you imagine shelves groaning, unable to hold another polished achievement. Your thoughts circle gold like a moth drawn to shine, ashamed of how instinct overwhelms reason. You remember laughing at fear once, mistaking confidence for armor that would never crack. Afternoon shadows stretch across the floor, fingers reaching, claiming space you thought was yours. You rehearse optimism silently, practicing a tone that convinces others, if not yourself. The commute home feels longer, every stop an invitation to reconsider where you're heading. Faces around you seem guarded, each person carrying a private tally they refuse to share. You realize dependence doesn't chain you suddenly. It teaches patience until waiting feels normal. At home, you count lights left on, then turn some off, learning restraint through repetition. As night settles, you accept that control faded quietly, leaving you to manage echoes instead. The fifth morning opens quietly, and you notice how silence has stopped feeling temporary, settling instead like permanent dust. You read messages from institutions that speak warmly, as if kindness could soften the edges of what they're asking. Every assurance feels conditional now, a bridge that might hold, but only if you step lightly and don't look down. You start to sense how dependence is negotiated politely with smiles that disguise leverage. At breakfast, you measure portions smaller, telling yourself, restraint is wisdom, not fear rehearsing control. You recall promises made years ago, bright and confident, and wonder when they quietly expired. Outside, banners celebrate prosperity, fluttering above streets where people walk slower, eyes lowered. You feel the gap widen between what is said and what is felt. A distance no explanation seems to cross. Conversations now orbit survival, circling closer each day, pretending it's still about progress. Gold slips into speech again. No longer metaphor, but shorthand for safety no one trusts completely. You resist the pull, telling yourself faith should be enough, though doubt answers louder each time. Afternoon brings fatigue that sleep can't fix, the kind that seeps into posture and breath. You realize control was never seized from you. It was leased, and the terms just changed. The city hum feels strained, like a machine running past its comfort, asking forgiveness with every turn. You practice gratitude deliberately, hoping discipline might quiet the fear learning new words. News breaks gently now, delivered in calm tones that make bad outcomes feel inevitable. You watch reactions ripple online, applause mixed with panic, and recognize both as coping. Evening finds you calculating contingencies you once mocked as pessimism. You sit with the thought that security has become a rumor, repeated often enough to sound real. Before sleep, you accept that collapse can look like order, maintained just well enough to keep you compliant. The sixth morning greets you with routine intact, which somehow feels worse, like a wound that learned to dress itself neatly. You notice how easily fear now fits into your schedule, tucked between meetings and meals without causing disruption. Headlines no longer shock you. They hum softly, familiar as an appliance left running all night. You catch yourself adapting, lowering expectations the way one lowers a ceiling to conserve heat. In conversations, reassurance circulates like recycled air, breathed too many times to feel fresh. You begin to understand how comfort can be rationed, dispensed carefully to prevent unrest. Your thoughts move slower, weighed down by caution, each decision passing through new filters of doubt. You imagine risk as a wild animal, once admired, now something to be fenced and fed sparingly. Gold glints again in your peripheral vision, a quiet constant that refuses to leave the room. You tell yourself you're only being prudent, though prudence now feels suspiciously like retreat. The afternoon stretches thin, and you feel yourself shrinking to fit the narrowed space of certainty. You notice how quickly people praise stability, even when it tastes like ash. Messages arrive praising resilience, and you wonder when endurance replaced hope as the goal. The city's rhythm steadies, not because it healed, but because it learned to limp efficiently. You feel gratitude for small mercies, then shame for how small your mercies have become. Evening light softens everything, disguising strain the way dusk forgives unfinished work. You rehearse explanations you might never give, preparing apologies for futures that haven't happened yet. You sense dependence tightening gently, a hand guiding rather than pushing, making resistance seem rude. Lying in bed, you realize anxiety has become background noise, something you notice only when it stops. Sleep arrives unevenly, and you accept that this is how control erodes, quietly, through adaptation. The seventh morning feels rehearsed, as if the day practiced arriving without surprises to keep you calm and compliant. You move through routines automatically, noticing how habit now does most of the thinking for you. News arrives wrapped in optimism, and you recognize the wrapping as carefully chosen paper hiding something fragile. You sense how expectation has been managed downward, so relief now comes from outcomes once considered failures. In quiet moments, you realize fear no longer shouts. It whispers, confident it will be heard. People speak of patience as virtue, though you hear it as instruction repeated until it feels moral. You notice how often gold is mentioned without excitement, discussed like weather, inevitable, and impersonal. That inevitability comforts you briefly, then frightens you, because it leaves no room to hope otherwise. You start accepting limits you never agreed to, adjusting dreams to fit corridors that keep narrowing. At work, ambition is praised in theory, but survival is rewarded in practice. You watch colleagues trade boldness for caution, each compromise framed as maturity. Your own voice softens, opinions rounded off to avoid friction you no longer trust yourself to endure. Afternoon light feels thin, stretched across walls like a promise made too late. You recognize how dependence grows strongest when it feels mutual, when everyone pretends no one is trapped. Conversations drift toward contingency plans, spoken calmly, like evacuation routes memorized long ago. You feel the strange comfort of belonging to a shared anxiety lighter than carrying it alone. Evening settles gently, smoothing sharp edges, teaching you how easily tension can be disguised as peace. You reflect on how resistance requires energy you've been trained to conserve. In bed, you accept that certainty has been replaced by management, and management now defines safety. Sleep comes easier tonight, and that ease unsettles you more than fear ever did. The eighth morning arrives gently, and you realize gentleness has become the preferred delivery method for bad news. You move through the day feeling supervised by invisible expectations you now anticipate without being told. Every update sounds measured, calibrated to avoid panic, which only makes you listen harder for what's missing. You notice how relief is praised more than progress, like survival itself has become a public achievement. Your plans grow modular, easy to shrink or discard, designed for a future that keeps changing its mind. In conversations, certainty is treated as impolite, while caution earns approving nods. Gold appears less often now, assumed rather than debated, a silent reference point no one questions. That silence unsettles you, because it means agreement has replaced discussion. You adapt your language carefully, sanding down edges that might sound like resistance. At work, timelines blur, deadlines stretch, and urgency dissolves into managed delay. You feel the weight of dependency in small favors accepted without protest. Gratitude is expected, and you offer it smoothly, practiced enough to sound sincere. Afternoon brings a calm that feels rehearsed, like actors holding a pose between scenes. You sense how easily order can be maintained when hope is rationed evenly. People speak of balance, but you recognize it as stillness, enforced by mutual caution. Evening news passes quietly, and you realize outrage has become inefficient. You stop imagining reversal, focusing instead on adjustment as a permanent skill. Lying down, you catalog what you still have, not what you want, and call it realism. The absence of fear feels strange, like numbness mistaken for peace. You drift to sleep understanding that collapse can feel calm, once expectations are trained to expect nothing more. The ninth morning feels lighter, and that lightness alarms you more than heaviness ever did. You realize you no longer brace yourself for headlines, trusting moderation to blunt whatever arrives. Conversations feel smoother now, edges removed, disagreement softened into polite variation. You notice how easily you accept this tone, grateful for calm even when it costs clarity. Gold is no longer discussed at all, present like gravity, unquestioned and always there. That quiet presence tells you decisions have already been made somewhere else. You adjust your expectations automatically, like eyesight compensating for fading light. The idea of sudden change feels childish now, something you outgrew without noticing. You watch markets move like distant weather. No longer storms, just seasons you dress for. People praise predictability, mistaking repetition for security. You sense how dependency feels safest when it feels boring. Small reassurances arrive regularly, timed carefully to prevent unease from growing teeth. You thank systems you once questioned, mistaking consistency for care. Afternoon passes unnoticed, time dissolving into a sequence of managed hours. You feel strangely proud of your adaptability, even as it costs you something unnamed. Fear returns briefly, then fades, trained to retreat when calm is reinforced. Evening conversations avoid extremes, settling comfortably in the middle. You realize outrage now feels impolite, like raising your voice in a quiet room. In bed, you sense the tragedy is nearly complete. Not with collapse, but with acceptance. Sleep comes easily again, and you understand this ease is the final symptom. The 10th morning arrives without ceremony, and you realize nothing is expected to change anymore. You wake rested, which feels like betrayal, as if comfort has learned to coexist with loss. The world moves smoothly outside, efficient and quiet, rewarding those who stopped asking why. You notice how records are announced with pride, even as meaning quietly drains from the word. Gold stands unchallenged now, not celebrated, simply accepted as the final reference. That acceptance feels like gravity winning an argument no one remembers starting. You move through routines that no longer resist you, shaped perfectly to your lowered reach. Conversations avoid ambition entirely, speaking instead of maintenance and balance. You feel the absence of anger and understand it was trained out of you patiently. Dependence no longer feels imposed. It feels natural, like weather you dress for instinctively. You thank stability for surviving, mistaking survival for victory. The city glows calmly, lights steady, nothing flickering enough to demand attention. You realize inflation was never a surge, but a slow tide that taught you to stand still. Prices didn't rise violently, they climbed politely, and you stepped down to meet them. Gold didn't soar suddenly, it waited, knowing patience would do the work. You understand now that collapse didn't break you, it trained you. What was lost was not wealth, but expectation, quietly surrendered piece by piece. You feel no panic at this realization, only a distant sadness you file away carefully. Lying down, you accept the new ceiling as permanent and stop imagining higher rooms. Sleep comes easily, and with it, the final truth. The tragedy succeeded because it felt reasonable,